Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Phoenix Gaming. I am your host, Nick. We are here today to talk more about Frosthaven, actually. You might be saying, why so much Frosthaven? It's because it's the game that's been consuming my life for the past 2 months or so, and I just find it to be absolutely delightful. For those of you who have played a bunch of Gloomhaven, you are probably going to take away the same sort of lessons from this that you would from Gloomhaven. I think that Gloomhaven and Frosthaven do have some strategy differences, but the main goal of this video is for me to talk about a piece of strategy that I don't think gets talked about very often in Gloomhaven or Frosthaven videos. And most of those, kind of guides and everything like that really focus on specifically card selections and strategies that you would use for that. And one thing that I think is underrepresented is how much strategy goes into even at the very beginning of the scenario. What you're doing on your way through, I would argue, is more on the tactical side, but your strategy going in of what cards am I taking with me is a really, really important decision. Even at first level, you have all your X cards, so you've got your level 1 plus your X cards, and that means that there are 3 cards you are not bringing with you in every scenario. And I think that there's a lot of information that can be gleaned from the scenario setup. So what we're going to do today is first we're going to talk about general approach for what you should be looking for, what you should be considering in terms of what the monsters are bringing into the scenario for what your setup is. We're going to talk about Bannerspear is going to be kind of our example as one of the easier, more straightforward starting class. And then when we go into the cards later, you're going to see why this is a really good example character at first level to talk about different strategies. And then finally, we're going to wrap up by pulling a few different scenarios and doing the essentially setup. We won't set them up, but we'll look at the setup and say what kinds of decisions are we going to be making, what are we going to be thinking about right from the beginning, just from the scenario description. I'm going to warn you right now that section of the video will have spoilers because I'll do scenario 1, but I'm also going to choose a couple other scenarios that are later on. So if you're one of those click through the video people, do watch out about not just clicking through to anything later on in the video if you don't want to see something in the scenario booklet. That's going to be the one spoiler warning I will give you about this video. All right, so without further ado, I want to talk about kind of the first part here, which is when you're looking at a scenario, what are the things you should be considering? What are your responses to various problems? And so the first one is, I think, pretty obvious, but when you see that there is a trap in a scenario or traps in a scenario, which it tells you right on the setup page, even if they're not set up in the first room, they'll tell you there's going to be a certain number of traps in that scenario. You should be thinking about 2 things a little bit more. Is 1, I should be taking push and pull because the traps are really not there to get in your way. They're primarily there for you to throw enemies into. In most Gloomhaven scenarios, traps are really to your benefit if you can make sure that you take some push and pull powers with you. The other thing is you might want to consider taking jump or fly or some other evasive abilities along with you so you can get to, another common use of traps is to hide sweet, sweet treasure behind them. So those are things to pay attention to. The other thing you want to consider in a scenario is if the scenario setup is on the narrower side. Ooh, that's quite see-through. Well, we're going to have to live with that. If the setup's on the scenarios on the narrower side because we're working with smaller tiles or maybe smaller tiles with obstacles, there we go, obstacles on them, it's going to limit the amount of space that you have in a scenario. And this is going to change a lot how this impacts you based on whether you're playing a 2, 3, or 4-player game. For those of you who watched my last video, I primarily play 2-player, but I will certainly talk about 4-player games. In narrow rooms, you're going to kind of prioritize those move cards that are like move 2s but do something special. Whereas in a lot of other scenarios, you really want your like move 4 so you can kind of cover the distance that you need to go throughout the scenario. But being aware that you're going to kind of be like trundling your way down here is going to be important. Your area attacks are going to be more powerful. Your attack 2 enemies that are next to each other are going to be more powerful. So those are the sort of things you'll be looking for in a narrow room. Suppose that you're actually in a much bigger room. A ship. This guy also kind of see-through. It's okay. we set this up for the cards, so we'll mostly focus on that. You got a lot of space in your scenario. You're going to be thinking about other things like having bigger moves so that you can cross bigger distances and avoid enemies in that way. But another thing that I think people don't think about quite as much is you are more likely to get surrounded in a bigger scenario. And so if there are more enemies, you might want to be taking something like Retaliate or Shield to punish or prevent the effects of those enemies in those larger scenarios as you're going through. The next thing I want to talk about is whether you are facing enemies that have elemental token powers. And so if you are facing enemies of various elements, then what you should be doing is taking cards that can use those elements. So if I'm fighting night demons or sun demons and I have cards that use night or sun, I should prioritize taking those cards with me into the scenario, because if those enemies make those elements, I can then grab them from them without having to do any setup myself. And conversely, I should be working to not aid those enemies quite as much, probably not making as many elements of the type that they would use in case they end up stealing it from me. While I'm trying to kind of set up my primary path. So you might want to kind of move away from that sort of card play style, even if your character is one that would normally use those elements and not craft them, kind of bank on paying attention to when they make them for you. Now let's start diving into actual monsters. This is the good stuff. When you are setting up a scenario, you get to pull the monster cards. And the monster cards, let me set this. There we go. And the monster cards are very, very informative. So we're just going to be looking at monsters as if they're level 1, things that you should be thinking about as you are considering this enemy going into this scenario. So the first thing I want to talk about is monsters with multi-target attacks, of which there are a fair number of in both Frosthaven and Gloomhaven, but there's an entire adventure path in Frosthaven where you'll be fighting many, many enemies with multi-targets. Multi-targets are bad for characters with summons. Summons are better in Frosthaven than they are in Gloomhaven, and multiple characters have little summons that they can do that do kind of little incidental perks. Your summons are going to do a lot less work in these scenarios because these multi-attack monsters are going to punish you for doing that. So that's something that I think is worth avoiding. Related to multi-attack is Pierce, because a lot of the multi-attack guys seem to have Pierce. Pierce is something that's pretty straightforward. Your shields are just going to be a little bit weaker in this scenario. That being said, most of the time, shields that you're going to trigger, you'll find that not all monsters in this scenario have Pierce, and because of that, monsters tend to be in clusters in both Frosthaven and Gloomhaven. There's kind of like a narrative structure that happens from room to room. And so you'll usually still be able to use your shield card. So I don't tend to play around Pierce ability all that often. Let's also consider the actual approach that our enemy takes. So ranged enemies are going to obviously be a bigger pain in the butt. We're going to get harried by one or maybe multiple of them who are kind of plucking at us from a distance. You need to find ways to close that gap, make sure that you're getting up to them. If you're a melee character and you have a melee ability that allows you to immobilize someone, there's a handful of characters that have like move such and such distance and then immobilize someone next to you. That kind of thing is more powerful if you're facing a lot of ranged enemies. You're going to have to be prepared to take a couple extra hits. Usually when there are ranged enemies in this scenario, you're going to take more hits, and you can't use the enemy's AI against them to prevent them from attacking you in the same way that you would when you are fighting our good friends, the melee characters. So melee characters, you have a lot more options against, and there are piles and piles of different kinds of melee characters in a game. One thing that's really, really powerful against melee characters always was in Frosthaven, in Gloomhaven, and was in Frosthaven as well, is the ability to ranged immobilize. If you have a character who can do that, ranged immobilize a melee character is functionally as good as a disarm or a stun for the round. However, you might notice that there are some melee characters who are immune to being pinned, so just be aware that that kind of tactic doesn't always work quite as much. And the other thing to consider is, are these melee characters that are hitting for a lot or not kind of hitting for a lot? If you know bears from the original game, you know that they kind of hit like a wall of bricks, and these ruined machines here, they kind of do a pretty weenie amount of damage. So there's a really different approach based on your enemy's melee focus. If there's lots of weenie melee characters, shields are going to do a lot of work in this scenario. And if they're hitting for a lot more, then actually it's usually more efficient to go for healing than it is to go for shields. It's also more efficient to go for mobility than it is to go for, kind of low move shields, because if you can just move out of the reach of these big guys, the best kind of tanking is simply not getting hit. Great. Let's talk about now the special kinds of abilities that enemies are going to be doing. We've got enemies that wound. We've got enemies that brittle. We've got enemies... Oops, that's not the right one. We've got enemies that poison somewhere. Looks like I forgot to pull my poison guy. We've got enemies that poison. If you've got one of those abilities, then heal moves up in the ranking, because a heal immediately solves a wound, immediately solves a brittle, and it solves a poison, but the poison prevents the healing. Particularly if you see poison, lots of little healing tends to be more beneficial. But just in general, any amount of little healing or large healing removes these conditions, which is going to essentially minimize the amount of damage you're going to take over a period of time. So paying attention to when these kinds of enemies are in scenarios and taking different cards to react to that, your move 2 heal self 1 ability is vastly different and higher on the ranking list of you should be taking this into the scenario based on what it is that your enemies are doing in terms of their abilities. There are a handful of abilities that I think they don't kind of go on any specific monster. So talking about things like immobilize, disarm, stuns, these are the kinds of things that can really take you out as a character, but they don't tend to be a baseline stat on monsters. So you're going to learn when folks do that more because you've learned their monster deck. I'm a kind of player that doesn't preview the monster deck, and I sort of learn them over the course of time. So Chaos Demon, which is new to Frosthaven, I'm not as familiar with its attacks, although I've faced a few of them, so I kind of have a pretty good sense of what they're doing at this point in time. Whereas there are other characters who I've played against tons in Frosthaven. I know exactly what their kit is going to look like. So when an imp is coming at me, I know that one of the cards in the imp deck is going to give me a poison. So it's something that I need to be aware about. However, they're not going to be doing things like the immobilize, the disarms, the stuns. If you are facing enemies that have those kinds of abilities, you just need to take at least just one card with you into the scenario that gives you something to do when you are taken out. So if you're immobilized and you're a melee character, having one ranged ability or top ability lets you support another character really helps you. If you're same kind of thing, any kind of attacking character, then being disarmed, if you're a Bone Shaper, who cares? You just summon a skeleton. But a lot of characters have just attacks on the top. So if you're thinking about that you might get disarmed by something like, say, a wind elemental, particularly at higher levels, then you should take something with you that allows you heal or allows you to do a more utility effect as a top ability so that you don't have a wasted turn, assuming that they hit you kind of in the later end of the turn, meaning it's going to affect your next turn where you get to choose what cards it is that you're using. That being said, again, those things are not so prevalent. And then there's a bunch of stuff that I just don't play around. Like this guy gives you muddle. There are monsters that give you curses. There isn't really anything that I think in the setup of the game I'm going to take particularly strategically differently in those things. They just kind of make me a little bit crappier. So that's something that I can, figure out along the way. Shields, I think, is one of the most important things to consider when you're looking at monsters. When you take shields, obviously the solution towards fighting enemies with shields is to take cards that have pierce with you. However, something like the City Guard is a kind of moderate amount of hit points and one shield functionally is just a higher hit point monster. You can get away with just kind of doming this guy repeatedly with decent attacks, or bring that Pierce card with you. It's not so important to prioritize a Pierce card you don't care that much about to fight something like the City Guard. The Flame Demon, on the other hand, is basically nearly unhittable. in Gloomhaven, there were more characters that hit for like 4, 5, 6 points of damage. In Frosthaven, I find that there are fewer characters that just give a really big wallop. And so bringing something, a Pierce, to fight this enemy is really powerful. There's also things to consider in that, like, things like poison and wound both go up in valuation against these kinds of characters. It's going to take you longer to ding down somebody with shields, so that extra damage from poison can mitigate, or in the case of a city guard, straight up wipe out the effect of their shield. And throwing a wound on the flame demon means that maybe you just don't attack it and let it bleed to death over the course of the next 2 turns. It doesn't mean you need to figure out a way to, get attacked by the flame demon in that time, but it is a pretty efficient way of dealing with this enemy without having to really deal with that enemy in the same kind of way. Enemies might come along with Retaliate along the way. Obviously, Retaliate is punishing for melee characters, so if you take some ranged abilities with you, or honestly just strategically, you're hoping that the ranged characters in your party are going to soften them up before you go for those killing blows. And taking 1 or 2 points of damage along the way is not so bad, but you want to be avoiding cards like, your 2 damage attack and a splash arc in front of you kind of things. That's not the way you want to take these out. You're going to kind of chunk them down piece by piece. The other thing to really consider is if there's enemies in a scenario that are going to summon, or in the case of Ooze's split, but you'll learn a couple new enemies that summon bad guys along the way, and they're really just is little more important in Frosthaven or Gloomhaven strategy than straight up running to someone who is going to summon or create another monster and getting in their way. There's 2 ways to deal with summoners. One is to just kind of plug them in a corner so they've got nowhere to summon. And then the other way is to just kill them before they get there. In Gloomhaven, which had more crowd control, more stun ability, you could just kind of stun those people for the round and get away with it. But there are very, very, very few characters that can stun in Frosthaven. And so a lot of times you're just going to deal with these extra summons. And so finding a way to get to these summoners quickly and kill them is, I think, a higher priority than it ever has been. It always has been a priority. And then, of course, finally, you just have to bring your most evil cards for the monsters that deserve to die the most. All right, so now we talked about what monsters, what kinds of things you're considering at the beginning of this scenario. Let's talk about why the Bannerspear is going to be my example character for this, by quickly running through these cards and saying kind of where things are going to be considered. So this is to summon our lovely reinforcement, but also is a healing ability that heals all of your allies. If you're seeing those brittles, those wounds, those poisons, this is going to be a much more powerful card to play the top ability of in that encounter. This card primarily, I think, is a disarming card. It's hard to pull off because you got to be in a kind of almost flanking position with your ally. However, disarm is just to get good against almost every single bad guy, so I'm not really going to comment on that one too extensively. This card's a wonderful example of a card that you may or may not take into scenarios with you. The question is, like, are you going to get enemies that end up clustering up? So when you're fighting swarms of piranha pigs or imps, although imps don't tend to be kind of next to each other because they're ranged, but swarms of creatures, additional, guards or things like that, or if you're playing in a 4-player game, it's more likely that enemies are going to cluster up, and it's more likely that you're going to have an ally that's going to be engaged with them. Finally, this is also a push, so it's going to be more powerful in a scenario where there are traps or hazards to push those enemies into. So that's, I think, the kind of thing that I'm considering with Unbreakable Wall here. The Bomb Billy, obviously, is also very cool for that permanent shield. Always very powerful. Javelin here is a ranged, fine attack. This is the kind of card that you're probably taking with you into a scenario if you want a range attack or not. You're more likely to want a range attack if you have a very full, busy party, or maybe you're playing with some Bone Shaper that makes a lot of skeletons and some narrow fighting space. But the other thing is this is also a pull card on the bottom. Again, those traps and hazards are things that I'm going to be paying attention to in that kind of instance. The bottom of this card is really, really obvious. The shield only applies to ranged attacks. Look at your enemies to see if you care. The top here, wind, maybe if I'm fighting some creatures that make wind, such as wind elementals, I'll consider that. Here's our quintessential example where we have a pierce ability that is just obviously better if we have enemies with shields. Here's an example where we have wound really good against enemies with shields as well, putting that wound on them, so it's kind of ignoring that shield as it's accruing extra damage. Good against bosses if they have a lot of hit points and they're not immune to wound. And also just in general, good against people with a lot of hit points because they tend to last for a few extra rounds. So it does some extra damage along the way there. This card is, I don't think, too circumstantial. It's when enemies move or teleport towards you. So, not against ranged enemies, but I think this card's primarily for going very fast and doing a move 4 here. Muddle's good against everybody. This is a 5 damage attack, so really nothing to say here, I guess, except for the fact that there's kind of a flanking maneuver that you need to pull off here. So if you are in a scenario that has a big room, you're a lot more likely to be able to get around, move around enemies in that way. Whereas if you're fighting in hallways, those much narrower situations, you might not be able to pull off a flanking maneuver quite as well. Here we've got some healing with a regenerate. Healing with a regenerate is especially powerful with things like poison because all the conditions will go off, but you won't actually get any heal onto there. And so actually having some lingering heal that sits there is quite beneficial as well. Here we've got ourselves our melee pin. This is going to be more powerful against ranged enemies if we want to kind of rush up to them, pin them, immobilize them, I call it pin, and then prevent them from backing up, which is going to give them disadvantage on their attacks. This is not so impactful against enemies that are melee enemies because when I immobilize them, they're like, great, I'm already here. I'm happy to be smashing you repeatedly anyway. Here we've got another wound ability that you can throw at enemies from far away. And finally, here we've got another kind of ranged ability, although I don't think there's anything too terribly particular about why I would choose to bring this card maybe over the other, javelin card, unless I want that advantage or I really value having sun for one reason or another. So that kind of range of abilities, that range of choices that this character has, I think can be very informative in a scenario for what to do to set up. So without further ado, let us dive into looking at a scenario setup and then deciding what we're taking with us for that scenario based on those decisions. Let's grab the book. All right, so we're going to start here with scenario 1. If you don't want spoilers on scenario 1, I can't imagine that that's a thing that you're too concerned about. I'm not going to spoil anything past the setup, so here we go. This is a 1 complexity rating, so we know there's not going to be a lot of special rules in this scenario, which makes sense. That being said, we do have special rules right off the bat, so it's not going to be that straightforward of a scenario. First thing that we're going to check, of course, there we go. First thing we're going to check, of course, is basically the scenario goal. So our scenario goal here is complete when all enemies are dead. That is the Gloomhaven Frosthaven basic. That is basically what we expect to do in most scenarios, is kill all the bad guys. We don't need to pay attention to the text. Sometimes the text gives you a little hint about what you might see in future rooms. So consider that. But we don't need to consider the text nor the loot for the strategy that we're talking about today. The special rules here are about there's city guards that you have allies of that don't move. They just throw up shields and retaliate. They're basically just there to soak hits and for you to, ostensibly save them, right? Like they're there soaking hits. This is the first thing that I look at a lot of the times, this map layout, what we expect to see. So we've got 3 tiles here. So I'd expect something that's going to be maybe a 3-room scenario that connects to one another. You're not always right when you're in the setup. If you're someone watching that who says that, oops. And then the other thing I'll check over here is what do we have going on in the scenario key. We've got some difficult terrain, the purple banners. We've got some obstacles, these green banners, which can be in the way. Doesn't necessarily mean anything. If I saw something like 10 debris or something like that were there as obstacles, I would think, oh, there's going to be a part where someone's going to kind of be shut in, or there's going to be a wall somewhere later on. So I might want to consider taking a jump ability or a teleport ability. That's an option available to me. It's not with the Bannerspear, but maybe I have access to winged boots, and I'm choosing to take between winged boots and a boot that lets me, move some extra spaces or something like that. That is a very legitimate choice to make at the beginning of the scenario. Other than that, we don't need to consider too much there. We also get to look at our monsters. The monsters are listed here in the scenario key. We've got our Algox archers, which are pretty straightforward meat-headed archers. They hit for a ton of damage. We've got our Algox guards. If you've played Gloomhaven, the guards are kind of the quintessential monster. Not a lot to think about there. And then we've got priests, which if you've played Gloomhaven, you actually know what the priests can do. But even if you don't know these things, you can kind of guess a little bit. Archers are going to shoot you, guards are going to come up and stab you, and priests are going to be doing annoying stuff. Turns out that what it is mostly doing range attacks, but also being annoying in general anyway. And then we've got city guards here, but they're not fighting us. They're our allies, so we're really only worried about these 3 enemies. So in our first room here, we notice that we're kind of in a little bit of a blockade. There's a sort of narrow T section that goes here, and we'd like someone to get into the back to fight this archer or archers, depending on the number of players that you're playing. We've got a cleric hiding here in the back that's probably attacking our friend, the city guard. And then we've just got one poor, sad guard here to face up against us. So what you're going to do here maybe depends a little bit on what your player count strategy is. In a 2-player game, probably we're going to step forward and we've got to take out this guard, and then we're going to run over to knock out the archer because it's probably doing the most damage, and then we'll deal with the shaman last. You don't necessarily need to approach that way, but that kind of point A to point B thing does tend to be sort of one of the easier ways to approach the game. My partner and I also are players that really like to suit up at the beginning. So sometimes we'll choose to, kind of stay in the back here, or maybe even all the way in the back, intentionally go very slow on the first turn, put up our superpower things, and then go hard on round 2. That's a really common strategy for the 2 of us to engage in. In a 4-player game, you've got a little bit more diversity of options, depending on if anyone has any crowd control or anything like that you want to execute in the first round. Having that conversation about what it is that people are doing is even more important in a 4-player game than it is in a 2 or 3-player game. But let's just pretend we're playing a 3-player game, and we'll take a look at what cards we're going to take or not take into the scenario with us for the Bannerspear. All right, apologize for the kind of weird green screen situation, but we're going to do with what we can. Just be aware that this is blue right there, even though it doesn't want to show up that way. These are the first 5 cards that I grabbed setting up for this scenario, and I'll go through why. So first of all, when I'm fighting Algox have a lot of hit points. In general, they're not going to go down in one hit. So things like wounds or poison are a little bit stronger. So I went ahead and I grabbed these 2 cards to have those opportunities to do some wounding damage along the way. With some okay options for abilities at the bottom, particularly this one over here that lets me grant some allies the ability to move. That's pretty cool in a scenario where we start with some allies on the board, not to mention my fellow players, and we're all going to be kind of stuck in this first jammed up room. So I'm actually really liking combined effort for double reasons. So those were the 2 early ones that I grabbed. These 2 cards I think are cards that probably just come with me into every scenario. Having the ability to attack and disarm someone is just so good. Having the ability to attack for 5 is, across a lot of Frosthaven, kind of unheard of. Both of these require some setup, but I think they're both well worth the effort. Javelin is just to have a ranged attack, but actually the real reason I took it was for this bottom ability. A move 1, pull 2 is pretty sexy when you're fighting archers. Also can really help your teammates up and getting to close the gap between those different ranged characters. You'll also notice in that first room that shaman was on the other side of a log, which can be a real pain to get to, but you can just pull him up on that log and then beat his face in. So these were the 5 cards that I was most excited to bring with me into the scenario. It got a lot harder after that, and I'll tell you which cards I ended up cutting of the 13 cards, the 10 cards that I could choose out of the 13. But these are the last 5 that I took to set our hand there. So this top card, Driving Inspiration, I don't think the top ability is all that good, but it's okay and a little bit flexible. And honestly, I was just excited by the bottom ability because we have some extra allies in the game, and so being able to heal allies within 3 every turn, just depending on what the next room looks like. Maybe I can save a guard along the way who can then keep retaliating bad guys. The banner itself can take some hits. I don't know that this card is the right choice to take into this scenario, but I wanted to try it, so that's the card I would end up choosing here. Regroup is just to have a top action with some healing on it. I decided this one over another one, which I'll go into a minute. Just to have some ability there. And then that bottom, grant 2 allies within 3 and move 3. Again, having the guards in this scenario means that I can move them out of danger or move them into danger if they're at full hit points and I want them to be shielding and retaliating, taking some hits from the Algox along the way. those were the two choices I made up there. I think the ones in the bottom three here were a little bit more of a winner for me. So deflecting maneuver, first of all, I took the javelin, so I make wins. So every once in a while I'll be able to attack for 3 with an advantage here, and make my opponents have disadvantage, which is pretty good if I'm about to be a pincushion. Speaking of being a pincushion, I know there are ranged enemies in this scenario, so happy to take that bottom shield. I like deflecting maneuver for this encounter for sure. I think that was my 6th card that I would take. Set for charge here. I honestly, the top text is more or less irrelevant because I don't have any move 4s with me in this scenario. And I cut one of my move 4s for other reasons, which is maybe a mistake. If I was going to cut driving inspiration, I would put the other move 4 in that I was going to, they'll talk about in a minute. But I just need the ability to move some spaces, and being able to go really, 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 really early is always nice just to have that control. I mentioned that, having pushes can be helpful in a scenario where things are kind of jammed up a little bit. Also, the bottom of this, having a permanent shield seems great. That being said, I took a couple ranged attacks with me. So I think Unbreakable Wall is another kind of sketchy take. Like I said, as I was going through, these are the 2 cards that I would consider cutting. Maybe for the 3 cards that I did actually end up cutting in this scenario. And so we'll go through each of these. And the first card that I cut in this scenario is Tip of the Spear. It's a fine attack, but I don't anticipate that I'm necessarily going to get 2 enemies lined up in a row like that, given that there aren't going to be, I think, a zillion Algox. They're kind of a medium-sized monster, so in most medium-sized monster scenarios, you don't see them piling on top of each other. I don't need that Pierce for any reason. However, like I mentioned, that move 4 on the bottom might be really important, so this is a card that I cut, and it might be a mistake to do that, so something to consider on the way there. Resolved Courage here, I talked earlier about having some melee to a melee pin to attack archers, and I do think that's good, but I do need an ally at my back, and so I like to charge at an archer, and I'm not sure that an ally is going to be at my back while I do that. It just seemed that the scenario to trigger this was a little bit niche, and I was kind of uncomfortable about it, and I didn't think I'd get to do my 3 splash attack very often, so I ended up cutting this card as well. And then at all costs, while being able to heal all my allies is great, I really need the healing. I'm sure at some point I'm planning on kind of being the pincushion, which is why I ended up taking Regroup, which was the heal card that I took, rather than this one. I don't think that you can really do anything wrong in this scenario based on the setup, but that was kind of the logic between the cards there. So let's look at something a little bit more complicated. I will warn you what the scenario is before we get there, but let's move forward. Okay, so the next scenario that I'm choosing is scenario 26. Why am I choosing this scenario? There's a couple of reasons. One is that it has a straightforward end condition, but the way you get there is really weird. I think it's a super good scenario for demonstrating a couple strategic examples of things that you need to consider along the way. I also quite loved this scenario. I thought it was a lot of fun, very unique approach to the kill all enemies objective that exists. And then the third thing is that I don't think that this scenario is that big of a deal to spoil in some ways. If you really don't want to know anything, don't watch this section. That's fine. I respect it. But there's not like content heavy stuff in here. And by definition, half of Frosthaven players will not do this scenario. It's kind of in a forked path where if you do this one, you didn't do the other one and vice versa. So, you might not even see it anyway if you're just playing through one campaign. So take of that what you will, and we'll go ahead and take a look at number 26, which I'm showing right now. You've been fairly warned. Number 26 is the Quattral Library. First thing that we need to consider here are the special rules. So this special rules say all ruined machines, which are those little weenie guys in the back. We'll look at their stat blocks in a second. In fact, where did I put their stat blocks? Oh, they're over there. All right, all ruined machines focus on moving towards and occupying the pressure plate, which is right here. And then they find focus as normal, perform any other abilities as if they had no movement. If they cannot find a path to the pressure plate, they will move to get as close as possible as measured by range. If any figure occupies the pressure plate, this scenario is lost. All characters and character summons cannot enter the hex of the pressure plate in any way. At the start of the 7th round, read some text in the book. So the text goal here is that the scenario is complete when all enemies are dead. But right now we have a lot of hints that actually the goal is to survive. We are going to be whittling down these enemies. If you can burst them all down, that's great, but something weird is going to happen on round 7, and we need to protect this pressure plate before they even get there. This is one huge room in this scenario, so we're not going to be doing a lot of moving back and forth. In fact, what we're probably going to be doing is getting to this pressure plate and holding the line or trying to push the enemies back into the room. So right off the bat, I can see that having high movement is not going to be as significant in this scenario, which is great. As a Bannerspear, it kind of feels like we're not so great at moving around, so we love that. We've got 3 enemies in here. Let's take a quick look at all of them. The enemy number 1 that we need to be concerned about here is the Ruined Machine, not for its threat, but because it's trying to make us lose. We notice that they have a pretty paltry move speed of just 1. This scenario, I think, gets a lot harder when you bump up to level 2 because they're moving double their rate. So it depends on what level you are, but we're going to pretend you're level 1 for this scenario. And they don't attack for very much either, and if you fought them, you know how very goofy their attack deck is. I won't spoil any of that for y'all, but you'll probably have fought them and have a sense of what they can do when they get here, so you can use that knowledge as well. And they have not many hit points, but not so few hit points either that most characters can take them out in 1 hit. You're probably going to need them twice, and that makes it a real pain to mess with them as they're coming in. We also noticed that in the 2-player game, we're actually going to start with these guys as elites, so they're going to have 8 hit points. So they're just kind of relentlessly pushing in that way. I did end up playing this scenario 4 players, so we had lots and lots of weenie guys, but these 2 elites in the back are what you're going to see in a 2-player scenario. So just being aware of what that looks like, pretty important. The next thing we're going to have to look at is our old friends, the Ancient Artillery, which show up in the various kind of corners of the room. And the Ancient Artillery here, they don't move at all. That's really significant for us to know. You probably already know this if you've played Gloomhaven, and they just shoot. They're just going to be sitting there shooting you because they're artillery. Even if you don't know them, you can make sense of that. They have a decent, healthy chunk of hit points, but no particular abilities that they themselves are due. You just can't muddle them. And then we've got our steel automatons here, who are our big beaters that stand in the middle. Just a bunch of hit points, a bunch of shields. Big trundling robots that are going to come hit us. They can't be poisoned, and they can't be disarmed. So, by the way, 2 of our enemies are immune to poison. Fortunately for our character, we don't use poison. But right off the bat, we're not going to be bringing poison to this scenario if we are a different kind of character. So something for us to be aware of. So based on this information, we are kind of protecting a centerpiece of the room. There are a lot of choke points with a lot of different obstacles that are in the way. But these enemies are going to be relentlessly moving towards this pressure plate, or at least the ones in the back, while the artillery and the big guys are going to be shooting us. So we need to prevent these guys in the back from getting to the middle, while also dealing with the nonsense of all these guys shooting us. So let's come up with a plan of 13 cards, 10 of our 13 cards that we're going to take from here based off of this. Okay, we will go card by card. And try to not use the green screen, see how that goes for us. So first we're going to start off here with Deflecting Maneuver. This is a card that's just for us to hold the line at the front, so when we get up there, having people have disadvantage to attack us is good. If we're getting plucked away by the artillery, then we can use the bottom of this ability. This is probably a card that's going to go on the earlier side, and this card's fine. I think it's just mostly a role player for us. I could see cutting it for something else. Combined Effort, I'm pretty excited by. Generally, we're going to be adjacent to an ally in such a tight scenario like this. The ability to have myself and allies within 2 move 2 spaces to reposition is huge, and this wound is going to be really helpful against those really big hit point monsters along the way. I think Combined Effort, both sides of this card are going to do a lot of work for us, and it's clearly quickly becoming one of my favorite Bannerspear cards, even though I haven't played this character. I just love wounds, in case you can't tell, but I also think because the enemies are going to be piling towards that center pressure plate, there's a really good chance there's going to be a lot of choke points where we're going to hit multiple people with our wounds. And I also think that actually the summons are going to be relevant for this scenario. Let's talk about why, and I'll just show you that I took tons and tons and tons of summons with me into this scenario. The reason is that enemy AI is really bad. It's really bad on purpose, and this scenario is clearly set up for you to exploit the enemy AI by dropping a banner directly at the end of one of those bookshelf rows, making it so there's no way for enemies to go through, they will ignore going down that row because there's no reason movement-wise that they're going to go there. The big automatons will act differently. The big automatons will attack the closest enemy, but you're going to have a much better sense of where those automatons are. And so I think you're actually going to be able to exploit your summons in this scenario, block off choke points that are going to be a lot harder for enemies to move around. This torchbearer is going to move of their own accord, of course, but if you stick them down in a tunnel somewhere, if you're low on player count and you need extra places to block off, these guys can get in the way in a way that I think is really, really helpful. I mentioned already why I think the banners are going to be really good in this scenario, just as essentially like creating sort of like dumb barriers that my enemies can't get through. I will say that I'm not sure how easy it would be to trigger this formation as this character in this scenario because of the choke points that are there. So I could see cutting that card, even though I said earlier that I think it's a card that you pretty much always take with you. This card I just took because I think we're going to be doing King of the Hill, so depending on how many allies I'm playing with, the healing at the top might be really relevant. The reinforcement to help us with our maneuvers is nice, although they can't get around them for flanking maneuvers, so this is also a card I could easily see cutting in favor of other cards. Driving Inspiration here, I chatted down this card when I first looked at it, and I keep taking it. I think this is, the Banner of Hope here is the one that I want to throw down somewhere, and then King of the Hill, it's just constantly spamming heals as the enemies are charging my position. I think this is a way that I can exploit that enemy AI, prevent them from moving down towards the pressure plate. Then I took a couple cards to make sure the enemies don't get away from me if they are getting very close to stepping on that lose condition pressure plate. So we took the ability to push people here, as well as the ability to pin people here. These two cards are just to make sure that none of that nonsense happens along the way. Tip of the spear here, that pierce right there, of course, an acknowledgement to our automaton friends who are going to be hard to kill, who we've kind of whittled down with our wounds, hopefully. Finish them with a couple jabs at the tip of the spear. And then pincer movement here. Man, 5 damage is a lot of damage, and we love some muddling, even though we can't muddle the ancient artillery. But it's going to be hard to trigger this one. There's not going to be a lot of instances where you're going to be flanking enemies in a position like this. So I'm not so sure about this card. I will say that at the bottom, though, the move one, loot one, really good for choke points in situations. So that's actually viable. I'll show you the 3 cards that I cut this scenario, and any of those cards that I said I would bring in with me, you could just kind of swap out. Javelin here, a fine ranged ability, but we don't really need to be doing ranged abilities, so you could put this card in if you wanted to. It's totally solid and offensive. I don't generally want to be pulling enemies towards me, though. Maybe the ancient artilleries, but for the most part, I want the enemies to be far away and stay far away in this scenario. Set for charge. I just took this out because I didn't think that I needed to move 4. And I know that these enemies are all on the slower side because they're all robots, and robots don't tend to have the highest initiative numbers from what I've seen in my experience. That being said, the enemy moves to a hex that's adjacent to you. This could be something you set up for a multiple turn where you set for charge, but it really does depend a lot on the enemy AI cards that are drawn. Hard to plan for this in advance, and I don't love that. And then regroup here. This is one of the cards that I really, really did consider putting in just for the heal because I'm going to be King of the Hilling a lot. And I think that the enemies are going to come at me. This is probably the top card I would put in otherwise, but it just didn't make the cut because it's only a heal 2, and that regenerate might not last for very long depending on the circumstances. And I already have a card that lets me move some allies within a couple spaces of me. Actually, now that I'm saying this out loud, I could put my banners down and then reposition them to confuse my enemies more. So now that I'm actually looking at this, I would probably cut maybe deflecting maneuver because it just doesn't do the damage that I want it to do, and then put in regroup so I have the option of moving my enemies because I really want to be playing this summons game in this scenario, which is not normally the approach for Bannerspear, but we just want to be plugging all those holes so the enemies can't get at us. Third and final scenario incoming. All right, the last scenario that I've chosen, because I'm looking for a 3 complexity scenario, is Scenario 71. If you don't want to see it, Scenario 71 is upcoming here. And this is a scenario that I chose because we've played a couple scenarios where there was not a lot of movement required, and I wanted one that was a little bit farther ranging that has a lot going on with it. So 71 coming up. If you don't want the spoilers, don't watch this part of the video. We're near the end anyway, so it's your call. Okay, now that we're here, the other real reason we chose this scenario is because this is an escort mission. Scenario is complete when the Artificer C occupies any G. We see neither C nor G in our starting setup, so we don't know what that's about. At the end of that round, read this. If you read the introduction text here, it's clear that there's a fight going on at the docks, and we hear some guy who's in trouble, so we're going to his place to help him out, and then figure it out along the way. We can also look at our introduction here, and what I said at the beginning is true. There are a lot of rooms to get here, from here to the end of the scenario. Assuming that indeed it is a linear scenario, it might even be that we need to run all the way to the end, pick up this guy, and then bring him somewhere else. We don't really know. So we're going to need a lot of movement in this scenario, something that the Bannerspear has not demonstrated a great strength with so far, so something for us to consider. We see a lot of enemies along the way here, which kind of scares us, and then we read the special rules here, which says all Abael, I don't know how to pronounce this, all Abael scouts and piranha pigs are allies to each other and enemies to all the other monsters. And then, if no characters have entered their turn adjacent to the Artificer by the end of the 12th round, the scenario is lost. So we got to move in this scenario, and the Abael Scouts and the Piranha Pigs are fighting everything in the middle here, the Lightning Eels, the Lurker Claw Crusters, the Lurker Mind Snippers, the Lurker Wave Throwers. I won't give you any spoilers about what those monsters do, aside from what I'll show you on their character sheets, but I'll tell you right now that a couple of those characters have some annoying abilities that would impact your decision if you were thinking about those and going into this scenario. Other things to notice, we've got some traps in this scenario. Love to push people into it. We've got 6 rubble, 4 water, 2 barrels, 3 crates, 1 mast, and 2 supply shelves. That's a lot of room in this scenario, but that's also a fair amount of clutter along the way. We've also got a couple treasure chests along the way, which frankly is probably not going to be our responsibility. If there are other characters that have higher mobility than we do, they're probably going to be the ones grabbing the treasure chests in this scenario. We're going to be trying our best to keep up. So let's take a look at these monsters so we can do a little pre-prep. All right, we've got our Abael Scout. They are really weenie, but they always give us poison. So these really annoying kind of shock trooper guys. And we know scouts from Frosthaven. We know that they might do range attacks. They might do melee attacks. So we just need to be worried about those guys. Piranha Pigs, unless they're elites, are just guys. They're just random mooks. So if they're elites, they're going to be wounding us. But for the most part, they're just people that have movement and attacks. Lightning Eels, even weaker than the Piranha Pigs, and they can only move in water spaces. So we'll have to see if there's water along the way. And then let's get into the Lurkers. The Lurker Mind Snipper here, multi-attack and pierce. And we maybe don't know much more about them except for the elites muddle people. But you probably do if you've played against them at this point, so you have a few ideas of what attacks are coming. Lurker Claw Crushers here, lots of hit points with the shield. Not so painful though, but they will attack multiple targets. And they break items if they're elites, which only matters if it matters to you. And then we've got the Wave Throwers here, who have a fair amount of hit points, but also don't do that much damage. And they have a pin ability if they are elite. So it's important to note that these Lurkers have kind of multi-target attacks, but they're not doing that much damage. Whereas we've got the Scouts here and the Piranha Pigs who are fighting them that are a little bit more shock troopers. So it'll be interesting to see them kind of fight against each other, but we're not interested in them fighting against each other. We're interested in when we have to fight them. So let's look at our 10 cards now. All right, a couple tough cuts here, and you're going to accuse me of liking wound too much, but hey, I just like wounding people. We started off with pincer movement here. This is a card that I could see being cut. I'm worried that this is going to be a scenario where there are lots of enemies fighting each other, and so the idea that one of my allies is going to be on the flanking side of them is maybe a little bit harder to pull off. That being said, 5 damage is just too good to give up, especially at this level, so I'm going to find a way to make it work, and worst case scenario, a move 1, loot 1 isn't bad, so hard to not take this into the encounter. My favorite card, of course, is coming into this encounter with me. The ability to attack 2 people is just, sorry, it's just 1 person. It's just one person. Everything I said earlier about being two people, I misread this card. That being said, I'm still taking this card with me. It's just not as insane as I thought it was. But the ability to attack a person and give them a wound when we've got these giant crabs that have shells is just going to be well worth our time. Functionally, combined effort is almost as much damage as pincer movement, right? This is 3, and a wound is another 1 before they even act, so it's kind of like doing 4 damage that then leaks for additional turns. And I think it's a little easier to set up this formation than it is to set up this formation. Plus, in a scenario where we need to move, even though we're probably on the slower side, getting our allies that extra movement probably going to be pretty helpful as well. Tip of the spear is a tip of the hat to 2 things. This is actually one of our best cards going into this scenario. Interesting because we didn't take it for one of our earlier scenarios, but it's got pierce to kill those crabs, and it's got move 4, which we're definitely going to need. We noticed that in this first room there were not any crabs, so we're going to be using this as a move 4 to move our way through this room on the latter side of a move, probably as we're moving to open the door. I'll talk about door opening theory in another video. I just apparently really like Incendiary Throw. Sounds like there's going to be a lot of monsters. They're going to be fighting each other, and I get to throw a Molotov cocktail on them and wound them all on the way. Heck yes, this sounds great. I'm here for it. Incendiary Throw is my boy. I probably am not going to be summoning this Torchbearer in this scenario because all the crabs get double attacks, so they're going to just kind of shred through this guy before she does. Actually, it looks like a she. Whatever, gender's a construct, before they figure out what it is that they're doing in the scenario. So unlikely that I'll summon, but I do really love that throw. You just got to go with the disarm card. This is just a solid card all the time. Nice to take out an enemy. And the way my allies and I could be doing it, I can see a scenario where we kind of sneak up on bad guys that are fighting each other, stab the guy in the back with the disarm, and then let the rest of them worry about their business. The Javelin here is very similar in concept. If I have enemies fighting each other, I'd like them to keep their aggro on each other, so I'm happy to chuck a Javelin at them from distance, or to pull one of them out of the conflict so that me and my friends can beat them up at the bottom of this ability. Javelin, I think, is going to do a lot of work in this scenario. This card right here, set for charge, fine, the top of it, but really it's the move 4 at the bottom. We need those extra moves because we got a long way to go in this scenario, and our 2 move 4s both made it into the deck this time for that reason. I don't know that we're going to be getting hit by a lot of range attack in this scenario, but it is entirely possible. We mostly took this card just because there could be a lot of chaos and madness. We're going to want to be body blocking for our alchemist friend when we find him. Where's an alchemist? Artificer friend, for our artificer friend when we find him, and because we're going to be body blocking for him, and it sounds like there's just going to be a lot of chaos going on in this scenario, we just want to make sure we're taking less damage. I'll also point out that giving your enemies disadvantage, I don't know exactly the math behind it, but in my head I have disadvantages as roughly being equivalent to -1 on the attack. And that makes this kind of like a shield. So against a lot of enemies that are doing a lot of like 2 and 1 attacks, this actually becomes pretty impactful. This card here is a push, is just an acknowledgement to the fact that we have traps along the way. And if I'm deciding to lose a banner, like this is actually a scenario where I have to make a tough choice. And if I want to, I could see putting this card out, this shield 1, all your range attacks have -1 range, right from turn 1. But if I'm doing that, there's a decent chance that I'm going to swap out Javelin and or Incendiary Throw for some other things. I'll talk about that in the cards that I cut. But if you want to start this scenario by putting this shield out, this is a really good scenario for it because of the fact that so many of the enemies are doing 2 and 1 base attacks, and it seems like there's going to be a lot of them along the way. I would respect that choice in this scenario. So I think you got to make that kind of call right at the beginning. I mean, you can change your mind partway through. Like if I lose Javelin on my first short rest and then I say, okay, well, I'm farther along in the scenario now, so now I'll throw out the shield for the rest of the scenario. That's pretty legitimate. I think that would be a reasonable thing. And then card 10, I think, was the easiest pick of all of them, actually. No, the move 4 with the Pierce was the easiest pick. But having this heal 2 and regenerate is just helpful into those opponents that are going to be poisoning us along the way. Plus the ability to ricochet our allies within 3 spaces. And this is absolutely insane when we are playing with escort missions. We can just send the people off where we want them to go. I didn't mention that with this card as well. But man, Bannerspear is really, really good in these escort missions, and I love that they have a character who's like, go, 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 get out of here. All right, let's talk about the 3 cards that we didn't make it, and will bring us to a wrap. This card was a really tough cut for me. The ability to heal all allies is very significant in a scenario with poison. The problem is that benefit kind of gets mitigated because we'd really... this would be better if it said heal 1 all allies and not this like suffer damage for people that heal or something like that. Ooh, whose hit point value increased with the heal ability. I misread this. This card probably should be in there. I probably should cut a card and put this in there to deal with poison. Also, just a lot of nonsense going on here. Also, I can heal my friend if he ends up getting hurt. I should not be summoning the reinforcement in this scenario while I'm fighting crabs, because the crabs are just going to attack him and kill him really easily. That being said, he doesn't take a hit. If I really need him for a formation, you can get an experience for him for doing it and everything. It's okay. But yeah, I probably would put this card in actually just for the top ability. So I need to figure out another card that I would cut for that. Banner of Hope didn't make the cut this time. 2 damage just isn't enough, especially against enemies with shields. Banner of Hope, we're going to be moving here. We don't really care about the banner ability. And Resolved Courage, I might be able to do this sweep attack somewhere, but melee immobilizes I just don't value a ton. I've unfortunately cut this card in every scenario, so there's got to be somewhere where I can use it, and I'm not thinking about how to use it correctly. But that's what we're thinking. So let me know in the comments whether you agree or disagree. Hopefully this gave you some insight into how I think about going into a scenario at the beginning. I think that first part of what am I facing in this scenario, and am I taking the cards that are best equipped to deal with it? A lot of times those the builds you find online are great. They will tell you the best cards that you can take with you and the powerful things that you can do with them. However, I think that Frosthaven is a little tougher. The enemies are they require a little bit more finesse. Your cards are not as busted as they were in Gloomhaven. And now my cat wants to play Frosthaven. And so because of that, you just need to be even more tactical at the beginning of the adventure as you're going that way. Hope you like the video. Leave me comments if you agree, disagree, anything you want to discuss. I'm always happy to break it out. I'll also add the caveat that I've not played the Bannerspear myself, so this is just going off the fact of what I think these cards are. If I have misread them, let me know, because I'm kind of digging the idea of how this class is working and may play it one day. So let me know what y'all think. Thanks, everyone.